The great dining room at Penmore Hall was lit by 20 candles the night Lady Vivienne Ashcroft walked in and found her place at the table already taken. And the woman sitting in her chair did not move, did not look up, did not so much as set down her wine glass. Vivienne stood in the doorway with 20 pairs of eyes turning toward her in the particular, awful silence that only English society can produce. And she understood, in the space of a single breath, that this had been arranged, not stumbled into. Arranged. Her husband, Lord Gideon Ashcroft, sat at the far end of the table, speaking to the gentleman beside him, and had not yet raised his eyes. The candles burned. The soup tureen waited in the footman's hands. Vivienne's fingers found the clasp of her evening bag, and she made, in that moment, the only decision that would preserve what remained of her dignity. She set the bag on the sideboard, turned, and walked out of the room before the first course was served, before her husband had looked up, before a single guest could watch her face change. Outside, the January air struck her like a hand. She crossed the entrance hall without slowing, and the footman at the front door pulled it open with the expression of a man who has been trained not to register what he sees. The carriage was still in the drive. She had arrived only minutes before. She climbed in, and the door had not yet closed behind her when she heard footsteps on the stone steps, running, which was not something Clement Ashcroft did in public. And then his voice through the frozen glass, muffled but urgent, saying something she could not fully make out. She did not stop the driver. She did not lower the window. The carriage moved, and the lights of Penmore Hall receded through the ice-clouded glass, and Vivienne sat with her hands folded in her lap and her spine perfectly straight. And she allowed herself, alone in the dark, exactly what she had refused to permit herself in that dining room. It lasted perhaps 2 minutes. A single, brief collapse. Not weeping, precisely, but something that lived in the same neighborhood. The sharp inward breath, the tightening at the base of the throat, the moment when the body insists on registering what the mind has already moved past. Then she sat straight again. By the time the carriage reached the gates of the east wing, she was composed. By the time she reached her private rooms, she was already thinking in sentences. She sat at her writing table without removing her gloves and drafted the first letter to her solicitor, Mr. Hartwell, in Harrogate. A brief, precise communication requesting that he confirm the current disposition of the Penmore settlement accounts and the terms of her marriage contract as they pertain to the management of the estate's principal properties. She sealed it before the wax had fully cooled. The second letter was to Clement. She wrote only, "Come tomorrow morning, early." She signed it with her given name, not her title, which she had not done in 3 years, and which she calculated he would understand. She did not sleep. She sat at the window in the small chair she kept for reading, still in her dinner dress, and watched the frost form on the glass in patterns that moved inward from the edges. And she thought about the chair. Not about Gideon, not yet. About the chair. About the particular quality of Rowena Fitch's composure as she sat in it. The way she had held her wine glass, the angle of her shoulders, the deliberateness of not looking up. That was not the posture of a woman caught in a mistake. That was the posture of a woman who had been told she would not be removed. Vivienne had met Rowena Fitch twice before, both times at functions in London, and both times she had registered her the way one registers a name mentioned too carefully in conversation, with the knowledge that there was more to know and the decision not to pursue it. She had been, she understood now, making that decision for 3 years, not asking, not pursuing, telling herself that the distance that had opened between herself and Gideon was a natural consequence of 8 years of marriage, of his political engagements, of the way that men of his particular type moved through the world in a self-contained orbit that wives were not invited to enter. She had founded a school in the village. She had raised Maisie and written to Oliver at his school and managed Penmore's household with the kind of quiet competence that nobody notices because it never fails. She had, in other words, been enduring. She had been enduring so thoroughly and so silently that apparently someone had decided it was a permanent condition. She rose from the chair at 5:30, when the frost on the window had gone white and opaque, and she washed her face and changed her dress and sat down at her correspondence. When the housemaid came in at 7 with the morning tray, she found Lady Ashcroft reading a letter from the school's board of trustees with the expression of a woman whose evening had been entirely unremarkable. Clement arrived at 9:30, which was early for him, and which told her he had not slept either. He came through the door of her sitting room with his hat still in his hands and the look of a man preparing to manage a situation that had moved beyond his ability to manage. And then he stopped, because Vivienne was seated at her writing table in a day dress, reading correspondence, with a cup of tea at her elbow that was still warm. "You are dressed," Clement said. "I am always dressed by 9, Vivienne replied, setting down the letter. "Sit down, Clement." He sat. He was 39, 4 years younger than Gideon, and he had always been the brother who said things aloud that Gideon left in silence. It was one of the qualities Vivienne had relied upon, quietly, for 8 years. She looked at him now across the writing table and waited. "I came last night," he said. "You didn't stop." "No," she said. "I didn't." Clement turned his hat in his hands. He looked at the window, then at the floor, then at her. "There's something I should have told you 2 years ago," he said. "I didn't, because Gideon asked me not to, and I believed at the time that he had good reasons. I don't believe that anymore." Vivienne said nothing. She folded her hands on the writing table and waited. "2 years ago," Clement said, "when I first heard that Rowena Fitch had reappeared, that she was making herself visible at events where Gideon would be present, I went to him. I told him I intended to speak to her directly and make clear that whatever had existed between them was finished, and that she was not to approach his wife." He paused. He stopped me. He told me it wasn't necessary. He told me... Another pause, shorter and harder. He told me that Vivienne would endure anything. The room was very quiet. Outside, a cart moved along the gravel of the East Drive, and the sound of the horse's hooves came through the window glass clearly and then faded. "He said it," Clement continued, not as contempt. "I want you to know that. He said it as though it were a reason you didn't need to be protected, as though your capacity to endure things made the problem less urgent." He stopped. "I have thought about that sentence every day for 2 years, and I am only now understanding what it actually meant." Vivienne looked at him for a long moment. Then she asked, "Do you believe it?" Clement met her eyes. "No," he said. "I do not." "Then help me," Vivienne said. It was not a plea. It was an instruction, delivered in the same tone she used when speaking to the school's trustees about the winter fuel account, precise, practical, and entirely without doubt that it would be followed. Clement looked at her for a moment, and something in his face settled, the way a man's face settles when he has finally made a decision he should have made some time ago. "What do you need?" he asked. "The household accounts," Vivienne said. "Specifically, any quarterly disbursements from the Penmore estate accounts over the past 2 years that do not correspond to ordinary household or estate expenditure. And anything bearing Gideon's signature in connection with Rowena Fitch, any instrument, any agreement, any correspondence that has passed through the estate office." Clement looked at her, You think there's something specific? I think, Vivienne said carefully, that a woman does not sit in the chair of the mistress of the house with that particular quality of composure unless she believes she has a right to be there. And rights of that kind are generally documented. She picked up her pen. Find me the document, Clement. He left within the hour. Vivienne returned to her correspondence. He was back the following afternoon, and he came in through the side entrance that connected to the estate office rather than through the front of the house, which told her he had not wanted to be seen. He carried a leather portfolio under his arm and set it on her writing table without speaking. Inside were 2 items. The first was a ledger, an estate accounts ledger, the kind kept by the estate secretary, with quarterly entries marked in a secondary hand that Vivienne did not recognize. The entries ran back 2 years. Regular payments, each one a substantial sum, made to the account of a Mrs. R. Fitch, recorded under the heading of miscellaneous estate expenses in a column that Vivienne had never been given cause to review. The second item was a single sheet of paper, older than the ledger, folded twice and carrying the particular quality of a document that has been handled many times. It was a promissory note. It bore Gideon's signature and a date 3 years prior, and it committed him to a sum of money in settlement of an unspecified prior obligation. The kind of language that told a careful reader everything about what was being avoided in the naming of it. Vivienne read both documents without speaking. She read them slowly, with the same attention she gave to the school's funding applications. When she had finished, she closed the ledger and placed her hand flat on top of it and sat still. The picture that assembled itself was not the one she had been carrying. She had been carrying, without knowing it, a picture of a husband who had grown distant and careless and allowed a situation to develop through negligence. A man who had not thought clearly about what he was permitting, who had perhaps been briefly weak and was now too proud to address it. That picture had been terrible enough. This picture was different. This picture was of a man who had known, for 3 years, that a woman held a financial instrument that gave her leverage over him, and who had been paying her quarterly in silence to keep her at a manageable distance. And who had, when that arrangement had finally collapsed into last night's dinner, still not told his wife that any of it existed. She had not been replaced by accident or by passion. She had been managed. She and the situation had been managed together as a single domestic problem, by a man who had decided that keeping her ignorant was a form of protection. She did not send for Gideon that morning. She sat with the closed ledger under her hand and the promissory note beside it. And she thought about the shape of what was in front of her. And she understood that this was not a fight that would be won by confronting a man in his study before she knew what she was asking for. She had one weapon, and it was the fact that she now knew precisely what had been done, and he did not yet know that she knew it. She would wait. She would choose the ground. Rowena Fitch arrived the following morning at 11, announced by the footman as a caller, and Vivienne received her in the front drawing room with the fire lit and the tea tray present, because she had been expecting her. Rowena was 34, and she was beautiful in the particular way that women are beautiful when they have learned to use it as a professional tool. Not carelessly, but with precision. She came in with an expression of soft regret already arranged on her face, and she sat in the chair across from Vivienne and accepted tea and said, in a voice that was almost kind, that she was terribly sorry about the confusion at dinner, that it had not been her intention to cause any distress, that there was simply a small matter, a private matter really, of no great importance, that had not yet been properly resolved between herself and Lord Ashcroft. and that she hoped, once it was settled, that everyone could move forward with their lives. "The promissory note," Vivienne said. Rowena's expression shifted. "Not much, but enough." "Lord Ashcroft discussed it with you," she said. "No," Vivienne said. "He did not." A pause. Rowena set down her teacup. "The note represents an obligation that was entered into in good faith," she said, "and that remains, at present, unsatisfied. I have been patient. I have accepted quarterly arrangements that were, frankly, inadequate. But patience has its natural end, Lady Ashcroft. And I think you will understand that I am not in a position to simply surrender a legitimate claim." "I understand your position perfectly," Vivienne said. She did not offer more than that, and she did not look away. And after a moment, Rowena Fitch picked up her gloves from the arm of the chair and stood. "I hope Lord Ashcroft will see the sense in resolving this promptly," Rowena said, "for everyone's sake." "I will pass along your hope," Vivienne said. After Rowena had gone, Vivienne remained in the drawing room for a moment, listening to the sound of the front door closing. Then she heard footsteps in the entrance hall, Gideon's footsteps, which she had known for 8 years and could identify by their particular quality of deliberateness. He came to the doorway of the drawing room and stopped, and then he moved to stand beside her at the window, closer than he had stood to her in months, and he looked out at the drive where Rowena's carriage was disappearing through the gate. He did not speak immediately. Vivienne waited. Outside, the carriage turned the corner and was gone, and the gravel drive sat empty in the gray winter light. "I can end this," Gideon said. His voice was quiet, the way it always was when he was being careful. "There is an outstanding balance on the note. I can pay it privately, through Hartwell, before the end of the month. It would be done. She would have no further claim." Vivienne turned to look at him. He was watching the empty drive, his jaw set in the way it set when he had already decided something and was presenting it as a discussion. "And what would that resolve?" Vivienne asked. "The debt," Gideon said. "The note would be discharged. She would have no legal standing." "I am not asking about her legal standing," Vivienne said. "I am asking what it would resolve for me. If you pay this debt privately through Hartwell, without my knowledge, as you have been paying it for 2 years, through the estate accounts without my knowledge, I am in precisely the same position I was in before last night, managed, uninformed, and invisible." She looked at him steadily. "A private settlement does not restore anything that was taken from me. It only makes the taking tidier." Gideon was quiet. He had turned from the window now and was looking at her, and she could see him searching for the argument that would move her. The practical argument, the protective argument, the argument that framed his management of the situation as consideration for her well-being. She watched him find nothing. "Vivienne," he began. "I know about the ledger," she said. "I know about the quarterly payments. I know what the note says, and I know when it was signed." She said it simply, without heat, and watched the words land. "I am not asking you to explain it today. I am telling you that a private settlement is not what I want." He stood very still. Outside, the wind moved across the empty drive, and somewhere in the east wing, a door opened and closed, and Maisie's voice carried briefly down a corridor, bright and distant, before fading. Gideon had no immediate answer. He stood there with his hands at his sides and his face very controlled, and Vivienne looked at him for a moment longer and then turned and left the room. The following morning, Clement came to find Gideon in the estate office, and he closed the door behind him, which he rarely did. And he said what he had been composing for 2 days. I am not going to continue protecting this arrangement, Clement said. I want you to understand that clearly. Gideon looked up from the papers on his desk. Clement. I told Vivienne about the phrase, Clement said. She'd endure anything. I told her what you said to me and why you said it, and she asked me whether I believed it, and I told her no. That is where I stand. He moved further into the room and stopped in front of the desk. What you did, deciding what she needed to know, deciding that her silence was the same as her agreement, managing her dignity as though it were an estate matter she didn't need to be consulted on. That was not protection, Gideon. That was a failure of respect. And I am done being the instrument of it. Gideon went very still. This was what he did when he was shaken. Went very quiet. The way a man goes quiet when the ground beneath him has shifted, and he has not yet found where to place his feet. She has the ledger, Clement said. She has the note. She knows everything. And she knows it because I gave it to her, and I would do it again. He picked up his hat from the chair beside the door. She is the best thing in this house, Gideon. She has been the best thing in it for 8 years. And you have been so busy managing the world around her that you forgot to look at her. He left. Gideon sat at his desk for a long time without moving. That afternoon, he went to find Vivienne. He had spent 2 hours composing what he intended to say. The final, private resolution, the argument for discretion, the case for protecting what remained of their standing by keeping the matter contained. He found her in the library, standing at the tall window that faced the north garden, where the last of the winter light was coming in flat and gray across the frost-hardened grass. He crossed the room. He did not begin the speech he had prepared. Instead, he stopped beside her and took her hand. Her left hand, the one nearest him, without asking, without offering explanation or preface. Her fingers were cold. She did not pull away. She also did not look at him. She kept her gaze on the garden, on something in the middle distance that he could not identify. And he stood there beside her, holding her hand, while the lamp on the writing table burned steadily and then flickered once in a draught from the old window frame. He did not know what she was watching. He understood, standing there, that there were things she was seeing that he had never thought to ask about, and that this was a recent understanding and a costly one. 3 days later, Rowena sent word to Penmore Hall, not a visit this time, but a letter delivered by her own footman, addressed to Lord Ashcroft and left open on the hall table where Vivienne found it before Gideon did. The letter stated, in terms that were polite and entirely transparent in their intent, that Mrs. Fitch intended to attend the Whitmore Winter Ball at the end of the week, and that she hoped the occasion might provide an opportunity to resolve, before friends and acquaintances, the small matter of property that remained outstanding between them. It was not a hope. It was an ultimatum. Full payment, or she would raise the promissory note before the assembled guests of the Whitmore Ball, before the same society that had witnessed the Penmore dinner, as a public claim against an unsatisfied debt. Vivienne set the letter back on the hall table and went to find Gideon. She found him in the morning room, and she handed him the letter without speaking, and she watched him read it. He went very still. That particular stillness she had now learned to read, not as indifference, but as the way fear presented itself in a man who had never learned another way to carry it. His jaw tightened. He set the letter down on the table and stood with both hands flat against the surface. Vivienne looked at him and understood what was happening inside him. And she did not offer comfort. She had been offering comfort for 3 years in the form of silence and patience and endurance. And she understood now what that had cost both of them. She left him with the letter and went upstairs to change for a brief errand in the village. A matter connected to the school, a delivery of materials that she had arranged before all of this had begun. She was gone for 2 hours. When she returned to Penmore Hall and came through the entrance door, she found Gideon waiting in the hall. He was standing near the door, and when she came in, the footman moved forward to take her coat, and Gideon stepped forward and took it from the footman's hands before the man had properly reached her. He held the coat himself. His hands found the collar, and he held it open for her. The ordinary, intimate gesture of a husband helping his wife with her coat. A gesture so entirely unremarkable in its form, and so profoundly absent from 8 years of their marriage that Vivienne stopped for a full second, her arms half raised, and simply stood there. He saw her stop. She could feel him register it. The slight change in his breath, the way his hands stilled against the fabric. Neither of them spoke. She finished removing the coat, and he held it for a moment before passing it to the footman. And the footman withdrew, and they were left in the entrance hall, in the particular quiet of two people who have noticed the same thing at the same moment and are not yet sure what to do with the noticing. She summoned him to the library at 11 that night. The house was quiet, the servants long retired, and when Gideon came through the door, she was already at the writing table, and on the surface in front of her were both documents. The quarterly payments ledger, open to the first entry, and the promissory note unfolded. Gideon came in and stopped when he saw what was on the table. Then he came to stand on the other side of it, and he picked up the ledger, and he held it. "I want to ask you 2 questions," Vivienne said. "I would like honest answers to both." He looked at her across the table. "Ask," he said. "Did you pay Rowena Fitch money, on a quarterly basis, to keep her from acting on that note?" "Yes," he said. "Did you do it without telling me?" He answered quietly, "Yes." The lamp on the writing table gave the only light in the room. Outside the frost was hard and the garden was dark, and the house made the small sounds that old houses make at night. The settling of timbers, the movement of cold air through gaps in the frames. "Then I want you to understand what was actually done to me," Vivienne said. "Not the money. The money is a practical matter. Not Rowena Fitch. She made her choices, and I can address them." She looked at him steadily. "What was done to me was this. You knew, for 3 years, that something existed that directly affected my standing in this house and in this marriage. And you decided, without asking me, without telling me, that I did not need to know about it. You made that decision on my behalf. You managed my dignity the way you manage the East Tenant farms, as a matter that falls under your authority to handle without consultation." Her voice did not rise. It never rose. This was what people meant when they said her composure was slightly frightening. "You confused my silence with my consent, Gideon. I was silent because I trusted that the distance between us was something we could find our way back from. I was not silent because I agreed to be kept uninformed." He stood without moving. He held the ledger, and he did not attempt to explain. And he did not attempt to deflect. And he did not offer the word protection as a justification, which told her that Clement's words had reached him. He simply stood and heard her, and she watched him hear it. Watched something move through his face that was not the controlled, managed expression she had been looking at for 3 years, but something rawer and more honest than that. She closed the promissory note and set it on top of the ledger in his hands. Then she turned toward the door. "Vivienne?" he said. Only her name. Just the 2 syllables of it, spoken quietly, in the way a man says a word when it is the only word he has left. She turned. He set the ledger on the table and crossed the distance between them and kissed her. Slowly, without speaking, without the preface of explanation or the hedging of qualification. It was not a desperate kiss. It was deliberate and careful. The kiss of a man who has finally stopped managing the moment and is simply present in it. She did not stop him. She stood with her hands at her sides and let it happen. And then she rested her forehead against his and closed her eyes. And the room was very quiet around them. "I need something from you," she said. Her voice was low. "I need you to fight for me. Not manage, not contain and arrange and settle quietly. Fight. I need to know that you understand the difference." He was close enough that she could feel him breathe. "I know the difference," he said. She stepped back and looked at him. She did not say whether she believed him yet. She left the library and went to her rooms, and the lamp on the writing table burned on for a while after she had gone. Gideon stayed in the library alone. He stood at the writing table with the promissory note in his hand for a long time. Then he sat down and took out a sheet of paper and wrote, in his own hand, a deed of assignment, a legal transfer of the promissory note into the name of Lady Vivienne Ashcroft, Countess of Penmore. He signed it, sealed it, and left it on the writing table where she would find it. He went to bed. He lay awake until the gray hour before dawn. At dawn, Vivienne came downstairs in her dressing gown, as she sometimes did when she could not sleep, to sit in the library with a book. She found the document on the table. She read it twice, carefully. Then she sat down in the chair and held it in both hands and looked at the frost on the window. And for the second time in a week, she allowed herself a brief, private moment that she would not have permitted in company. Not grief this time, but something in the neighborhood of relief. The particular sensation of a weapon that had been used against you being placed, unexpectedly, in your own hands. She dressed. She wrote 2 letters. She was ready before breakfast. The Whitmore ball was held on Friday evening, in a house that was larger than Penmore and considerably less comfortable, in a ballroom that had been built for display rather than warmth, and that held, on this particular evening, the same collection of families who had been at the Penmore dinner the week before. Society, in this part of England, was a small and long-memoried creature, and every person in the room knew what had happened at that dinner. And every person in the room was watching the door when Lord and Lady Ashcroft arrived together. Vivienne wore dark blue, which was not a color she wore often, and her evening bag was small and black, and she kept it on her wrist throughout the first hour of the evening. Gideon stayed close to her, not performatively, not in the way of a man staging a public demonstration, but simply close, the way a person stands near something they have decided not to leave unattended again. They spoke to their hosts. They accepted champagne. They moved through the room with the particular composure of 2 people who are carrying something that no one else in the room can see. Rowena arrived at 9:30. She came in through the south doors with the deliberateness of someone who had planned her entrance. And she moved through the room with a composed smile and a small leather case under her arm. And Vivienne watched her from across the ballroom and felt something that was not fear settle into something that was not quite readiness, but was very close to it. Rowena did not approach them immediately. She made her way around the room, speaking to 2 or 3 people, and then she moved to the center of the space near the fireplace, where the largest cluster of guests had gathered. And she spoke in a clear and carrying voice, to no one in particular and everyone in general. "I wonder," Rowena said, with the smile of a woman who has rehearsed this moment, "whether Lord Ashcroft might be prevailed upon to address a small matter of property this evening. while so many friends are present to witness the resolution. She produced the promissory note from the leather case and held it with the ease of someone holding a letter of credit. It is a modest thing, a note of obligation, signed and dated, that has been outstanding for some time now. And I think we might all agree that the simplest resolution is the most satisfactory one. The room was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something is happening that everyone will describe tomorrow. 20 or 30 faces turned toward Gideon. Gideon did not move. He stood beside Vivienne and did not move and did not speak. And Vivienne understood, from the quality of his stillness, that he was waiting. She opened her evening bag. She took out her copy of the deed of assignment, the document Gideon had written in the library at dawn, transferring the note into her name. And she unfolded it and held it in both hands, and she read from it in a voice that carried clearly across the room, without elevation, without drama, with the precise and unhurried diction of a woman who has been waiting all week for this exact moment. "The promissory note you are holding," Vivienne said, looking at Rowena directly, "was transferred by deed of assignment into my name on the 14th of January. I am the holder of that instrument." She paused. "The debt it represents is settled in full." The room was absolutely silent. Vivienne folded the deed of assignment and turned to the nearest footman, a young man from the Whitmore household who was holding a tray of champagne glasses and looking as though he wished he were somewhere else entirely. And she handed it to him with a brief, clear instruction. "Take this to the fireplace in the entrance hall, if you please, and burn it." The footman looked at the document, looked at her, looked at the document again. Then he turned and carried it out of the ballroom. And because the entrance hall was visible through the open double doors at the south end of the room, and because the fireplace in that hall was lit and bright, a good number of the assembled guests watched the document placed in the fire and watched it burn. Rowena stood with the original note in her hand, and nothing left to do with it. Her composure held, Vivienne gave her that. But the instrument was spent, and the room knew it. And Rowena Fitch was a woman who understood the arithmetic of a situation. She placed the note back in its leather case, said nothing, and walked toward the south doors. She did not look back. The room watched her go. Gideon took Vivienne's hand. He took it in front of the room, in the center of the ballroom, with every eye still on them, and he held it the way a man holds something he intends to keep. He did not make a speech. He did not turn to address the room, or offer an explanation, or perform any gesture of public declaration. He simply held her hand, and did not release it, and looked at her. And she, for the first time in the entire evening, looked back at him. The orchestra, after a moment, resumed. They did not speak in the carriage on the way home. There was nothing that needed to be said that words were adequate for, and they both understood this. And the silence between them was not the silence of the past 3 years. Not the silence of two people who have stopped speaking because they have stopped seeing each other, but a different kind entirely. The silence of two people who have been through something together and are sitting with the weight of it. Gideon took her hand somewhere past the 2nd-mile marker on the Penmore road. He did not say anything when he did it. He simply reached across the dark interior of the carriage and found her hand and held it. And Vivienne, after a moment, leaned her head against his shoulder. She had not done this in 8 years. Not without the calculation of what it would communicate, not without the small internal negotiation of whether it was safe to want something that directly. She simply leaned, and he did not move, and the carriage carried them home through the frozen dark. The following morning, Maisie came to breakfast at her usual hour of 7:30. in the state of partial dishevelment that characterized all of her morning appearances. And she climbed into her chair and reached for the bread and said, without looking up, "Is Papa staying this week?" There was a brief silence. Gideon, who was sitting at the north end of the table with his coffee and the morning correspondence, set down his cup. "Yes," he said, "I am." Maisie accepted this with the equanimity of an 8-year-old who has more important things to think about, and returned to her bread. Vivienne, at the south end of the table, did not look up from the letter she was reading. A reply from Mr. Hartwell in Harrogate, confirming the settlement terms she had asked him to review. She read the letter. She turned the page, and a smile crossed her face, quiet and unhurried, the kind of smile that belongs entirely to the person wearing it and to no one else. Gideon looked up from his correspondence. He looked at her across the length of the breakfast table, across the butter dish and the toast rack, and the winter light coming through the tall windows. And he did not look away from her again.